All right, good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Nico Luchsinger, and on behalf of Asia Society Switzerland, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this Oxford-style debate today. The question we want to address is whether China can reach its goal of establishing a world-leading semiconductor industry by 2030. To begin, let me quickly remind you of the structure of the debate today. First, in a little bit, you will all get to vote on whether you agree or disagree on today's motion. We will then have two teams arguing in favor or against that motion and trying to convince you. We'll hear opening statements and rebuttals from each side. After that, we will move into the discussion where we welcome your questions. Please submit them using the Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Finally, each debater will have 2 minutes for closing statements, trying to summarize up and convince you that their position is the right one. After that comes the most important part. You will vote again on the same question on whether you agree or disagree with the motion. And the team that has gained more votes compared to the beginning will be declared the winner. Today's motion is China will win the race for supremacy in the semiconductor production by the year 2030. We will start the initial poll now. You should see it on your screen, and you can vote yes if you agree with the motion, no if you disagree with the motion, and I don't know if you don't know. While you vote, let me outline what we are debating today. Semiconductors. Basically, every electronic device contains them. The smallest chips going in production have transistors only 3 nanometers apart. The supply chain is extremely complex, and only a couple of firms are able to produce the most advanced chips. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, is one of them, and currently by far the biggest player in the industry. Tech firms around the world depend on the chip making on the island. Many regions, including Europe, the US, and China, fear an escalation of the dispute over Taiwan and are trying to increase their domestic production. Chinese President Xi Jinping said in 2018 that semiconductors are as important for manufacturing than the heart is for humans. And he said, and I quote, "When your heart isn't strong, no matter how big you are not really strong." Also important to note that China actually spends more on semiconductors than on any other imported good right now. Part of China's Made in China 2025 industrial policy is to expand the local production of semiconductors to meet 80% of domestic demand by 2030. Today's debate will be on China's chances gaining the upper hand in semiconductor production. The poll is closed. Thank you very much for your votes. Let me now introduce our teams. On the side arguing for the motion, joining us is Sophie-Charlotte Fischer, a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich, and a research affiliate with the Center for the Governance of AI in Oxford. Sophie's research focuses on the geopolitics and governance of emerging technologies. Research topics include the US-China competition in emerging technologies, the EU's approach to geopolitics and technology, and the role of technology firms in international security. Joining her, arguing for the motion, is John Lee, director of the consultancy East-West Futures. He's also a researcher at the Leiden Asia Center, a consultant for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a co-lead on the EU-China Semiconductor Observatory. John's research focuses on China and digital technology, in particular China's cyberspace governance regime, the semiconductor industry, and future telecommunications networks. On the other side and arguing against the motion, Jimmy Goodrich, who is the Vice President for Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA, in Washington, D.C. In this role, Jimmy leads SIA's global policy team and directs SIA's international competitiveness, trade, export control, supply chain, global market research, and China policy agenda. That's quite a portfolio. Before moving to Washington, D.C. in 2012, Jimmy spent a total of 7 years working in the tech sector in China. And finally, joining Jimmy on the team arguing against the motion is Jan-Peter Kleinhans, Head of Technology and Geopolitics at Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, Foundation New Responsibility, an independent, non-party, non-profit tech policy think tank in Berlin, Germany. His focus is on the analysis of semiconductors as a strategic asset, how resilient the global semiconductor value chain is to external shocks, and how geopolitics affect this value chain. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to John, arguing for the team in favor of the motion, for your opening remarks. John, you have 5 minutes. Sorry, you have 4 minutes on the clock. There you go.
Thank you very much, Nico. I think we need to begin by defining what do we mean by supremacy, or rather, what does it not mean? Supremacy does not mean market leadership in every domain or technical leadership in every domain. What it means for our purpose is a dominant market position across the industry as a whole, one which allows Chinese industry and the Chinese party state to achieve its goals despite foreign opposition, which makes sense in the context of China's overall policy goals as the Communist Party leadership has set them out. Not technical leadership for its own sake, but making China a modern and powerful socialist country by mid-century, prosperous and able to assert its political goals against rivals. I'm sorry, I think that I may have had the button muted, but I will quickly reprise that. What do we mean by supremacy? It does not mean market leadership in every domain or technical leadership in every domain. But what it does mean is a dominant market position across the industry as a whole that allows Chinese industry and government to achieve its goals despite foreign opposition. This makes sense in the context of China's overall policy goals, and China already has in place the constituents for this in the semiconductor sector. An expanding chip design sector, which closely serves growing end-user industries, which are developing fast in China, with a focus on next-generation technologies such as RISC-V architecture. The leading market share Chinese firms have in the packaging section of the supply chain, and the large market share in fabrication at mature nodes. China's strengths in the larger economy linked to the semiconductor industry are a critical part of this picture. Again, technical leadership across multiple domains isn't required for dominant market power when you can have faster implementation of technologies and integration with fast-growing markets in the developing world. And when it comes to the critical technology gaps, China has been working on these for some time. Long-term state-led R&D projects to fill critical choke points have been running for almost 2 decades. For example, constituent technologies for photolithography, which have been complemented potentially by espionage, as the reporting about ASML has indicated. And in Chinese private industry, we see startups for EDA software and AI-oriented chips, to use only 2 examples, which have corresponded to recently introduced US export controls, which show great potential, although obviously they are starting from behind to fill these critical gaps within the time frame that we are discussing here. So while geopolitical conditions are challenging, they are also encouraging Chinese domestic industry to take import substitution seriously. And the senior political leadership in China also recognizes the necessary conditions, including giving the market a leading role, albeit with a heavy state hand, and maintaining international links with the global semiconductor industry. Perhaps most importantly, Washington will not be able to corral all foreign players into a united strategy to contain the development of China's semiconductor sector, as the news from just this week regarding South Korea and other countries, I think, strongly suggests. And therefore, the potential for it to effectively counter all of the advantages of the Chinese industry, which are already observable, which I have outlined before, are going to, it is unlikely that US leadership will be enough to turn the tide. And there, I think I will conclude with my 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, John, for this first opening statement arguing in favor of the motion. Let's move it right along. And I'm going to ask Jan-Peter Kleinhans for his opening statement arguing for the team against the motion. Jan-Peter, you as well have 4 minutes on the clock, which starts now.
Thank you very much. Let's start with what John just said, a dominant market position across the industry, across the semiconductor value chain. Well, if we talk about winning a race and supremacy, you would assume that supremacy includes dictating terms and conditions, being able to do as you please and to innovate to your heart's extent with your domestic industry. Now, with semiconductors, we have heard it in the opening statement to this debate. We talk about a transnational value chain that is defined by division of labor. So, of course, China might gain market shares in artificial intelligence chips. They might be able to have the most manufacturing capacity domestically. But can you really talk about supremacy if a cutting-edge AI chip that is used in servers from Alibaba or from Tencent or from Baidu relies on cutting-edge manufacturing in Taiwan that uses Dutch manufacturing equipment, Japanese chemicals, US chip design software? So here the concept of supremacy really does not fit to the realities of the value chain, which are transnational division of labor. And to be honest, if we dive deeper into that value chain, the fact that in many of those areas, for China to achieve supremacy, they would need to establish not just domestic alternatives to existing suppliers, but they would need to compete at the global cutting edge. If we look at manufacturing equipment, if we look at chemicals that need high purity levels in order to be used for semiconductor manufacturing, this is simply not feasible to go from zero to global competitive edge within 8 remaining years, because it's already September 22. So the reality is that, yes, it is nice to talk about the heart needing to be strong and only a healthy body relies on a healthy heart, or I kind of cannot get the quote right here. But the point is that semiconductor manufacturing is so complex as of today and is increasingly complex in the future. Just for the audience, we talk about more than 1,000 production steps, more than 60 different types of manufacturing equipment, more than 400 different chemicals, just to produce your modern semiconductor. And the whole process takes 4 to 6 months. To get an idea of the complexity, China would need to be able to at least establish market-relevant Chinese alternatives in every single of those 60 equipment areas, in every single one of those 400 chemical areas, to be able to say, we are supreme, nobody can dictate us. This will not happen within 8 years' time if in many of those areas you don't have a viable competitor established as of today. So as my last point, the reality is in 2030, China will continue to be highly reliant on foreign inputs for semiconductor manufacturing, and that includes on US inputs, on European inputs, on Japanese inputs, with the obvious geopolitical tensions around. Thank you.
Nicely done, Jan-Peter, to the second, perfectly at 4 minutes. That was excellent. Thank you so much. We'll move it right along back to the team arguing in favor of the motion. For your rebuttal, Sophie-Charlotte Fischer, the floor is yours for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Nico. I would like to pick up where my colleague John has left off. And in the next 4 minutes, I would like to redirect your focus to the year 2030 and actually offer another take on what supremacy could mean by then. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is one thing that we've seen over the last decade, it is how rapidly technology and the associated industries can change and develop. 10 years ago, we didn't have SpaceX reusable rocket launchers, Amazon's Alexa hadn't brought the Internet of Things into our homes, and DeepMind's AlphaGo hadn't beaten a human champion at the complex board game of Go yet. These examples illustrate that in tech industries, we cannot define what progress, let alone supremacy, means in an industry 8 years from now based on what we know and see today. We cannot simply assume that breakthroughs may occur along the same lines as previously, but we have to understand that they may happen on unproven and unexpected pathways. Especially when we look at the semiconductor industry, we should not only acknowledge that significant changes may occur until 2030, but we actually have to recognize the need for disruption in the industry. Let me tell you why. Moore's law, which refers to a prediction by Intel's co-founder Gordon Moore that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit would double roughly every 2 years and enable steady performance and functionality improvements, is likely to approach its physical limits. Most forecasters, including Mr. Moore himself, expect the law to end by around 2025. This prospect raises some fundamental questions. Where will the next big leap in the industry come from? And who will actually define then what supremacy means in a post-Moore era? The answer is China will. Ladies and gentlemen, China is especially well positioned to seize the opportunity presented by the end of Moore's law and to develop the next generation of semiconductor technology that will disrupt the industry. China has built up particular expertise in developing new superconductive materials and techniques that may allow it to transcend the current challenges to increasing computing power. One reflection of this expertise is a patent obtained by Chinese telecoms giant Huawei for a graphene transistor. But not only the industry, but also the Chinese leadership is acutely aware of this trend and this need for innovation in the industry. For example, in its current 14th five-year plan, Beijing has prioritized the development of third-generation semiconductors. More generally, China, as we've seen, has made remarkable progress in filing and obtaining new semiconductor patents relative to the US in the period from 2019 until early 2022. But let me be clear and also reiterate a point that my colleague John has already made. It is not only current research and development in China that uniquely positions it to leap ahead. I would also argue that the United States, with its increasingly restrictive controls on semiconductors and manufacturing equipment, is actually helping China to innovate. The restrictions significantly increase China's motivation and free up resources to explore alternative pathways to circumvent the restrictions, and we can already observe this effect in some areas. For example, faced with restrictions of the Trump administration on access to chips and manufacturing equipment, Chinese companies like Shanghai Micro have made important progress in advanced packaging lithography machines, offering one potential pathway to circumvent some of the US export restrictions, or at least mitigating their impact. Finally, US restrictions may up hurting its own position in the semiconductor industry and weaken its relative competitiveness until 2030. As John has mentioned, we have seen how reluctant even US allies like South Korea have been in supporting US policies directed against China, like the Chip 4 Alliance. This is hardly surprising given the important role that the Chinese market plays for South Korean chip suppliers, but also others, and this market share is only expected to grow. With that, I close my argument and yield back to our opposing side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this final, no, I'm sorry, we're not yet done. Almost forgot you there, Jimmy. I'm sorry. Finally, handing it over to Jimmy Goodrich, joining us from Washington, D.C. for his rebuttal from the team arguing against the motion. Jimmy, please, you got your 4 minutes as well.
Thank you. Well, I think picking up on what JP mentioned about no one country or company is able to completely dominate the global semiconductor ecosystem. Today, the United States, nor Taiwan, nor Japan, nor Europe, nor even China is in a single dominant position across the ecosystem. And by 2030, I believe that that will still remain the case, where multiple countries together will seam the fabric that creates this global ecosystem, from the advanced equipment materials to the design software to process technology. The semiconductor industry is not one single market. It's defined by multiple different verticals, hundreds of different types of chips, and for around 30 different types of semiconductor technologies. Each one of those is a microcosm of different companies, different economics, different barriers to entry, different technologies. Primarily, I think China by 2030 will still face major hurdles from becoming a leader in areas of semiconductor logic process technology and design for various different factors. Number one being the technological complexity, know-how, and workforce. But beyond that, also issues related to geopolitics, export controls, and other restrictions that Washington, D.C. and its allies are imposing on China cannot be denied will have a significant degrading impact on China's domestic capability. And that's certainly poised to increase as tensions between the US and China escalate. Simply bending the laws of physics is more and more difficult. Today, there are only 3 companies that are able to produce semiconductors at the most advanced feature sizes, 3 nanometers. None of them are in the People's Republic of China. And even companies in that 3-way race are struggling. Who is going to have the next generation 2, 3, 1.5 nanometer transistor? It's unknown at this point what that transistor architecture will be. Physicists, mathematicians, material scientists are working hard outside of China, primarily outside of China, to research, develop, and mass produce that technology. Today, China really has almost zero presence in the sub-7 nanometer production landscape, which is a major disadvantage. Once you're behind and not part of that ecosystem, it's very difficult to jump in the race and start from scratch. In addition, the US government, in partnership with foreign governments, has imposed export controls on China. First and foremost, the inability to import extreme ultraviolet lithography simply means that China will have very few, if zero, options for producing semiconductors below 5 nanometer, meaning that both between now and 2030, China will remain dependent on foreign sources of production for advanced logic devices. That will also remain the same for DRAM, as EUV is a gating technology for next generation DRAM technology as well. And estimates for China to develop their own extreme ultraviolet tool are very grim, perhaps could take 10, 15 years, if not longer, given the advanced technology, basic science, and physics, metrology, optics that are involved in developing those machines. So I believe that China will be increasingly relevant in the market. It will have an increasing share of sales. However, it will be as dependent, if not more, on foreign inputs for its own supply chain through the end of the decade.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for this final rebuttal. And that ends our first part of the Oxford debate with the opening statements and the rebuttal. We'll move into Q&A. We welcome your questions from the audience here as well. Again, if you want to ask a question, please submit it in writing on the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. We have about 20-25 minutes here for the Q&A, so the sooner you get your question in, the likelier is that we'll get around to asking it. I want to jump right in. Jan-Peter, I'm quoting here from a report that you co-authored recently, which said China has significantly stronger position across the entire semiconductor value chain today compared to 10 years ago. China should be expected to strengthen its national position in the global supply chain during this decade. How can we be sure this strengthening does not lead to supremacy? The direction seems to be clear. How can you be sure they're not reaching the goal?
It's always nice if you take me by my word, so thank you for that. It comes back to what Jimmy elaborated before. Without any question, China will play a more substantial role in many areas of semiconductor design and manufacturing in 10 years' time or in 8 years' time. We see that right now, for example, just as one very, very focused example in AI accelerators. A Chinese startup, Byron Technology, was just invited to Hot Chips. This is one of the, it's a funny name, but it's one of the leading processor conferences in the United States. And there, Byron Technology, a startup that existed for 3 or 4 years, just announced a new chip that is competing relatively well with the state-of-the-art from NVIDIA and others that is out there right now. And this is a major achievement, no questions asked. And it could very well be that in 10 years' time, we actually have highly competitive AI chips designed from Chinese companies in global servers and data centers. But this is very, very different from saying that China will have supremacy across the entire value chain, looking at chemicals, equipment, different types of equipment, like Jimmy said, different types of chips. It's very different to compete in power semiconductors to charge an electric vehicle than competing in AI chips, than competing in memory chips. These are all their own verticals. These are all different markets. So in that sense, I think my question from my sentence from that report still holds true, but it is decidedly different to talk about having stronger position in the ecosystem versus achieving supremacy, because this no single region can achieve.
Thank you. Sophie, we've seen just in the recent few months a slate of reports coming out of China that there are several corruption investigations going on against semiconductor executives, including crucially the head of what's called the Big Fund, which is a huge state-run investment fund that was supposed to funnel state money into the right directions in semiconductors. Aren't these investigations a clear sign that things are not going according to plan in China? And are they not actually already dooming the objectives for 2030? As was noted before, that's only 8 years away. So can you really achieve supremacy if you're busy investigating the people who were supposed to do that for corruption?
Actually, I think we cannot infer from these types of investigations that the companies and what they're doing and also the companies that they're investing in are actually not doing good work after all. So when we look, for instance, at these companies where the arrested executives came from, where they choose to invest in, are doing quite well. YMTC is one example. So I wouldn't say that this is a sign that the industry as a whole is not doing well. Of course, corruption is a common problem, as we've seen over the last few years in China. And this is certainly something when it comes to the distribution of money where improvements will have to be made. But I think this is not a prior for an indicator for how well the industry is actually doing and also the results that they can produce.
Thank you. Continuing quotes from recent news reports, Jimmy, the Biden administration, Reuters has reported just recently, plans next month to broaden its curbs on US shipments to China of semiconductors used for artificial intelligence and chip making tools. So effectively, it's trying, that's the Reuters report that I'm quoting here, to find the choke point where it could sort of squeeze China. And I think we can argue that, of course, in the short term, this may actually give China a disadvantage, hurt the supply that they're receiving. But wouldn't it be fair to say, as your opponents have argued in this debate, that these forms of export controls, denying China access to parts of the global value supply chain, will only strengthen and reinforce domestic production and may, in the long run, be counterproductive? So wouldn't it be, assuming you're taking your own argument that this is a globally integrated supply chain, wouldn't it be better for players like the US, but also Europe, to include China in this process instead of pushing it out, and with that only pushing it towards domestic production and possibly supremacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think certainly the industry and the international community would not like to see this level of pressure and tension between the US and China. And that's definitely leading to more restrictions coming from the US government. And absolutely, the net result of an export control is almost always to put an emphasis on the need for China or whomever else the control is imposed on to develop their own corresponding technology. However, there is, certain laws of physics and engineering that come into play, and it's not a question of will China have the determination to develop many of their own technologies? It's when and how long will it take? And in some areas, I think progress will be more rapid. For example, China's capability to develop manufacturing equipment, tools, software necessary for trailing edge semiconductors will certainly improve significantly. In some cases, I think China will be able to have a basically foreign IP-free production line for trailing edge technology, 90, 65, perhaps even 40 nanometer. However, trying to push that down to the leading edge by the end of the decade is still going to be a very difficult task. And at the same time, while China will be focused on just closing the gap as to where the global industry is today, the global industry is going to keep moving forward. So the innovation for lithography, for the next generation materials, for process technology is not stopping. And so what happens is when you're behind, you're continually trying to catch up to a competitor who's always running faster than you. And that is going to be a significant burden for China to be able to close the gap in the leading edge of technology. And I agree, strongly with my teammate JP. If you cannot close the gap on the leading edge of technology, it's difficult to achieve supremacy.
Thank you. John, turning to you, you started out with this really nice definition of supremacy and what it actually means. And I think this was excellent that you did that so that we would all talk about the same thing. But now my question to you is, assuming your definition of supremacy, does any single country today have supremacy in the semiconductor production? And if no, what makes you so sure that China could be the first country to actually achieve something no other country has achieved?
Well, Nico, I would say that it is correct. No country today has supremacy, even according to my definition. What is different about China is that it is developing a role in next generation industries, smart manufacturing, intelligent electric vehicles, various applications of artificial intelligence, and we could go on, which combined with the strengthening that JP referred to of the position of Chinese firms across the semiconductor industry will give it an unprecedented level of dominance. So once more, we are not talking about China being able to necessarily close the gap with that technology leading edge in every field. But we are talking about a situation where a country which is still dominant in manufacturing, and that of course is another assumption, which is probably the subject of another debate, but I've assumed it, which is playing a central role in all of these next generation technologies built upon semiconductors, also is attaining a very strong role, and in some cases an industry leading role across the value chain. As Jimmy said, unless we talk about the leading edge, in many areas, it's already possible to envision within the next few years an essentially Chinese IP-free supply, foreign IP-free supply chain in China. And once more, we talk about the ability to achieve the Chinese state's goals. It's not necessary for necessarily Chinese firms to be able to produce cutting-edge lithography machines, or perhaps the most efficient applications of substrates. Let's take gallium oxide as one that has also recently been export controlled by the United States. If the overall market power of Chinese firms in the industry, and again, all the industries built on top of it, means that the US government is not able to corral all of the other players in this industry to cut off China from those technologies, or to adequately supervise the black market for those technologies, or to gain visibility in the same way that the Chinese government can, because of its more intrusive powers, into all of the constituent technologies, then that puts China in a position with the upper hand. And that's how I've defined supremacy for the purposes of this debate.
Thank you very much. Now, as we mentioned at the top of this conversation, Jan-Peter, there's an obvious kind of geopolitical component to all of this. The world's leader in semiconductor manufacturing is Taiwan, which China regards as its territory and seeks to reunify with. So wouldn't it be possible for China to very simply achieve supremacy by, let's say, achieving reunification through whatever means that will be, but would sort of like integrating Taiwan's leading edge into the semiconductor production of the PRC not basically achieve that goal with one stroke?
Excellent question. I mean, this certainly pops up often. Maybe to regarding TSMC, again, it comes back to what Jimmy and I argued before. Don't think of TSMC in Taiwan as a monolithic company. It is really a network organization that pulls together suppliers from across the world, talent from across the world, to, at the end of the day, be able to manufacture the most advanced chips. And yes, it has around 90% of cutting edge contract manufacturing. So in that regard, for this particular part of the value chain, it certainly has achieved supremacy at the moment in time. But with reunification, what would happen to TSMC? TSMC depends on foreign talent that would most likely leave the country. TSMC depends on foreign suppliers. Those would most likely stop supplying to TSMC. TSMC, and I think this is the most important point, heavily relies on mainly US customers. Apple is the largest customer from TSMC. So what would China gain if they have access, or if they control even TSMC? They would take over a company that itself is highly reliant on the global ecosystem and highly dependent on US customers. So I'm certainly not the China expert in this round by a far shot, but I would say that if a takeover from China happens, that would be despite TSMC, not because of TSMC.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience as well now. And please, if you still have a question, you haven't submitted it, do this. You can also, instead of writing a question yourself, go through the questions we've received. There are plenty, and you can upvote the ones you would like to have answered most urgently, and I will try to prioritize these as well. For the time being, Sophie, the question from the audience is that given the complexity of semiconductor technology, is China's ecosystem and culture of state-run companies really capable of cutting-edge innovation? Is semiconductor production of the leading-edge kind that we're discussing here today really possible in a state-run environment? There are a lot of assumptions in this question, but I'm going to let you answer those as well.
I mean, this is obviously an often asked question and a concern that is often raised when it comes to China. But I think also looking beyond the semiconductor industry, China has really proven over the past 20 years or so that it's very well able to innovate, especially also in areas where, it doesn't simply copy something from the West, but really innovates. And I think the same we should at least assume for the semiconductor industry. As I also said in my rebuttal, we may see progress and new developments on pathways where we don't expect them yet, and where we may not see now, or where we not know now where it's coming from. So I would definitely say China is able to innovate, and we've seen this in many areas. We've even seen this in the semiconductor industry, and we should assume that China is able to do more, especially given the additional resources that will be freed up and the increased willingness that will come from the restrictions currently imposed by other states on China in this industry.
Thank you. And actually, I want to pick up something that you said in your statement and just repeat it now in your answer and put it to Jamie. So, Jamie, Sophie referred to this idea that Moore's law is coming to an end in the next 2 to 3 years, essentially, and that whatever advantages we will see on semiconductor innovation in the future will have to come from somewhere entirely different. So, what makes you so sure? I may have misquoted Sophie here, but I'll let her correct me afterwards. I'm first going to ask Jamie the question. What makes you so sure, Jamie, that the post-Moore wave of innovation in semiconductors cannot come out of China, and that will not give China the edge in semiconductor production?
Well, there's certainly been a graveyard of false predictions that Moore's law is coming to an end. We've seen that about every 5 years. The New York Times or IEEE Spectrum runs a journal article that says Moore's law is coming to an end. And you know what? Every time the industry finds a way to continue innovating. And in fact, the roadmap through 2030 is pretty clear for logic device development. There's a clear roadmap to go to below 1 nanometer with the innovation in the next 3 or 4 years of gate-all-around or carbon nanosheet technology. And then carbon FET technology, even beyond that, is under significant development. And for example, ASML right now is working on the next generation of lithography tools that will extend logic and DRAM scaling for at least another 5 years. So I think through 2030, there's actually a clear path for Moore's law to be alive from a technology perspective. The big, of course, wild card is investment. Will there be a major downturn in the market? Will there be a global economic depression that limits the ability for the industry to make the investments necessary to realize those next generation technology breakthroughs? There's a lot of reporting that in China will innovate the next third generation semiconductor, not based off of silicon technology, whether it's gallium nitride, gallium arsenide, or other compound semiconductor materials. I think this is actually just a complete misunderstanding of what compound semiconductor technology is. It doesn't replace silicon, it's complementary to it. So where silicon technology is going to be the predominant CMOS architecture for advanced logic, advanced memory and storage, that's about 2/3 of the entire global semiconductor market. Increasingly, the analog or power semiconductor market is going to see non-silicon based technology be more relevant. Where does that come into play? Things like electric vehicles, your power regulator for a solar panel, high power, high energy consumption devices. They're complementary, but not replacing those data center AI chips that sit in a supercomputer. So will China be able to ride the wave of third semiconductor generation development, as China says, to overtake the competition? No, I don't think so. That's a false prophecy.
Okay, thank you. John, turning to you, it's certainly the case, as I think both you and Sophie have argued, that over the last years and decades, China's economic and technological progress has been remarkable, and there has been a lot of true technological innovation coming out of China. But now we're seeing some headwinds. There's an economic downturn of sorts. There's a real crisis in the property market. The political environment is becoming more unstable. The zero COVID, has introduced a lot of uncertainty into the system. So wouldn't all these factors, sort of also contribute to a slowdown in industrial policy, to a slowdown in actually achieving technological advancement of the magnitude that would be necessary to achieve supremacy in the semiconductor production?
I think, Nico, what you're asking is whether the Chinese state is going to throw enough resources, despite all of these problems, at the semiconductor industry to achieve its goals. And the answer is yes, from my viewpoint. I think, for starters, a lot of these problems are slightly seen out of context. Yes, it's true that China's real estate sector is in serious trouble, but there are also scope conditions that make that quite a different problem from elsewhere. For example, Chinese banks are not going to fail. There is not going, the big state-owned banks that prop up the whole system, there is not going to be the equivalent of a lemon run. So although you will see a slowing of the economy, the flow-on effect to the government's resources, I think, there is not a one-to-one equation. But secondly, the level of intervention that the Chinese state can achieve is simply on a different order of magnitude, even under conditions of constraint like this, compared to what Western liberal democracies certainly have available. And I would say even, let's say, the other East Asian advanced economies. As Jimmy pointed out, really the question for the advanced economies is, will the investment dry up if the economic conditions are not there, or if the wrong government policy are put in place? And I've argued, and I'll re-sum up in a moment, that there are troubling signs that this may be the case. There are dark clouds on the horizon for the Western economies going forward. And there are a lot of questions over whether the approach being taken by the US government to export controls and even to the domestic support of the industry in cooperation with allies in, let's say, a non-zero sum way, is actually going to be effective. In the Chinese case, as I've said, I don't think that they are going to lack the resources throughout the industry. The question is how effectively they will be used. And there, again, we have to quote Kai-Fu Lee, who's a well-known commentator in the AI space, distinguish between efficiency and effectiveness. As Sophie has pointed out, the Chinese have been, this is perhaps a bit of a segue, but the Chinese have been successful in many cases where predictions were long made that they could not reach the technological frontier or even significant breakthroughs. And so the semiconductor industry is certainly, far more complex and a much more difficult nut to crack than any of the previous industrial examples. But the reality is that even if a lot of the money is wasted, if executives are arrested for malfeasance and so on, there is so much money and so much incentive and enough human talent, I would say, in the Chinese ecosystem by this point, that it would be very dangerous to bet against the Chinese approach being able to brute force, if you like, through many different sections of the supply chain. Again, this is not to say that they will achieve technical leadership in the sense of having the most advanced technology in every field. But again, if we talk about supremacy as an overall position of leverage in the industry, that makes it impossible, let's say, for Korean firms or Japanese firms or European firms to divorce themselves from the Chinese market and indeed to become increasingly dependent on the Chinese market in many of the industries built on top of semiconductors, and this is to say nothing of the developing world, where Chinese influence is much greater, then I think that there is definitely a shot for supremacy, as I've defined it, to be realized out, let's say, to the 2030 timeframe.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last very short question and answer from the audience. This isn't really going into to either of the teams. I'm going to just ask you, Sophie, and then maybe some of the others can jump in. The question is, does the China-Russia connection, the partnership without limits, as declared by the two countries in February, speed up the development in China, and can it become a game changer? I don't know what Russia would have in terms of resources for semiconductor development, but maybe it does. Is that sort of alliance, should it hold for the long term, going to affect the development significantly or not?
I would frame this a little differently. I think China has been very carefully observing what the US and its allies have been imposing on Russia when it comes to technology sanctions, or more specifically export controls, and especially also how these types of restrictions have now affected Russia's access to semiconductor technology. China has been working for a long time on sort of sanction-proofing its economy, insulating it from potential future external shocks. And as both John and I have argued, I would say if this alliance, or it's not officially an alliance, but if this no-limit friendship is doing something, it is again further underscoring China's willingness and also emphasizing the need to really become more independent in the semiconductor industry from Western technology.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This is all the time we have for the Q&A. We're going to move on now to the closing statements. Each panelist will get 2 minutes on the clock, and will proceed in the exact same order as we did when we started, which means, John Lee, the floor is now yours for your final closing statement at 2 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks, Nico. With 2 minutes. To restate, we must define this question correctly. What is dominance? Indeed, there is no prospect of one country monopolizing the leading edge in every technology in the semiconductor supply chain by 2030. But semiconductors are not end products. They are foundations for other technologies, and the industry is of strategic importance for that reason. Furthermore, semiconductors must be optimized for those end users. And where the industries are developing faster in China, not in every case, but even in many gray areas, the prospects for China are quite good to lead the global wave, at least as far as the bulk of the investment money, the fastest implementation of the technologies in practice is happening. That will have feedback effects to the Chinese semiconductor industry, as well as creating an overall position in which Chinese industry and the Chinese state, China Inc., if you like, will have the potential to achieve a dominant position over its rivals in the timeframe we're talking about, to 2030. So perhaps with the remaining 40 seconds, let me highlight a couple of specific things. As Jimmy said, in the case of logic processors, there is obviously a roadmap which may not be moved by, let's say, breakthrough technologies over the next 10 years. But nonetheless, the foundation that's been shown by Chinese industry, and if you look at the announcement caveat it is about SMIC's ability to make a chip now at 7 nanometers, there is clearly enough of a foundation there to build on in a situation where the foreign industry may not be able to keep moving forward the technological edge as fast as our opponents have predicted. I'm afraid that I have actually exhausted 2 minutes there, so I'll conclude, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, John. I just wanted to briefly, before we move on, you mentioned at the top there this announcement of SMIC, which is a Chinese company, to apparently have produced 7 nanometer chips. There's been some debate on whether that's actually true and how they achieved it. We couldn't get into this. That's just something if you're interested to follow up on. But now let's move on to closing statement from the team arguing against the motion. Jan-Peter Kleinhans, the floor is yours also for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I will actually go ahead and use the opportunity to take the SMIC 7 nanometer example as a great example for path dependency, because we are not talking about supremacy by 2050. We don't talk about supremacy by 2040. It's about supremacy by 2030. And for the remaining 8 years, it's all about path dependency. The technical roadmaps are set in stone. The existing dominant players will be for the supplier market, so the equipment, the chemicals, the semiconductor manufacturing will continue to be the dominant players as of today. So what happened with SMIC 7 nanometers was that SMIC was able to achieve something similar to a 7 nanometer process node, but based on inferior technology that has been so far used for 40 nanometers, for 10 nanometers. So yes, SMIC can say that for a very simple type of chip, a Bitcoin mining chip, they were able to produce that in 7 nanometers, but SMIC 7 nanometers cannot be compared in terms of process technology, level of sophistication with TSMC's 7 nanometers or Samsung's 7 nanometers. So the problem here again is that we dump down the complexities of semiconductor manufacturing and think that we can compare single numbers. The reality is that yes, this was an achievement of SMIC. No, it was no surprise because we already knew since more than 2 years that SMIC is working on such a production line, and they only achieved it for a very specific chip. Again, it comes down to path dependencies. And for 2030, the path dependencies for China are clear, and that means supremacy is simply out of the equation.
Thank you very much, Jan-Peter Kleinhans. We'll move it right along to Sophie-Charlotte Fischer in Zurich for her closing statement, arguing for the team in favor of the motion. Sophie, please.
Thank you so much, Nico. In my closing statement, I would like to reiterate some of the arguments that me and my colleague made that support the case that China will win the race for supremacy in semiconductor production by 2030. In my rebuttal, I have argued that we should be more open to defining what supremacy means by 2030 when we think about the uncertainties of the industry, and we should consider them in this definition. The limits in the industry as reflected by Moore's law, of course, there have been many wrong predictions, but it may very well be the case that we reach this limit at some point, gives us strong reasons to believe that supremacy may in the future mean something different from where the industry stands today. So, as I said before, we should be open for China to surprise us, given not only the current research path that it follows, but also the incredible resources that the Chinese government invests into this area, and yes, the element of surprise that we might see. So China has not only the vision, but it is well positioned to make breakthroughs that could disrupt the industry and capture a leading industry in this new emerging markets for semiconductors. As we've also argued in this debate, the current export control restrictions that we see from the US and also other states may further underscore this willingness and provide resources for China to follow these goals. And the development of advanced chip packaging, new transistor architectures, and new carbon-based materials could be game changers that we may not really realize as of today. So in conclusion, China may reach supremacy in semiconductor production by 2030, not simply by trying to catch up in areas that we currently already see, but by, quote, changing the lane and overtaking others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And last but not least, Jimmy Goodrich of the Semiconductor Industry Association, your closing statement arguing against the motion.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. So I think just going back, and if one were to look at the 5-year plan that the Chinese government has outlined since the 1980s, you'll see in the 14th, 13th, 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, et cetera, that China's goal was to achieve semiconductor supremacy in every one of those plans. And unfortunately, having a plan is not the same as implementing it. Even having unlimited amounts of funding is not the same as having the right know-how, technology, workforce, and market alignment to be able to innovate technology at the right speed necessary to meet market demand. That doesn't mean that China won't be successful in some areas. I agree with everyone that China will be increasingly competitive in trailing edge technology, commodity memory, and other areas, and maybe even in some trailing edge equipment and materials. But it'll still be dependent on key semiconductor leaders outside, not inside of China, through the end of the decade. Beyond 2030, we don't know what's the role of quantum computing and other items, but I think this is not necessarily in the scope of our conversation, but maybe for the next debate. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. This concludes our debate. Thank you, everyone, for your fantastic argument. It is now time for the final piece of the debate, which is, of course, the second vote for you, the audience. You will see the poll on your screen. Again, the question is the same as at the beginning. Do you agree with today's motion? Click yes if you do, click no if you don't, click I don't know if you still don't know. Because we've talked a lot today, I'll give 40 seconds for the vote in silence and we'll pick it up afterwards. We are ready. So this is the big reveal. We're going to see the results on the screen now. So in the first poll, 19% of you agreed with the motion and 49% disagreed with the motion. In the second poll, 26% agreed with the motion, 59% disagreed with the motion, and 15% didn't know. And so if I'm interpreting this correctly, the change is plus 10% for the team arguing against the motion, that is Jan-Peter Kleinhans and Jimmy Goodrich. Both teams actually won points, could convince people who didn't know at the beginning, but the team arguing against the motion, again, Jan-Peter Kleinhans and Jimmy Goodrich, got a little bit more. That means you win this debate. Congratulations to both of you. Thank you, of course, also to Sophie-Charlotte Fischer and John Lee for this debate. This was a tight result, and great to see that so many people could make up their minds in the process of this conversations. With this, we're at the end of today's Oxford debate. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Thank you in the audience for all your questions.